Hello, everyone. Today we're talking about what drives society from ancient Egypt until now. Is it the aggregate of human decisions of men and women, or is it the patriarchy and the concepts like toxic masculinity and the male gaze? Now, there's a very good podcast which I listen to called Afterlives of Ancient Egypt with Cara Cooney, which you can find on the web. And she presents that with her co-host, Amber Myers. And it's a very high-quality podcast. It's very, very interesting. And they always deal with fascinating topics from ancient Egypt. However, they do make references to the modern world, the world we live in. That brings up some very interesting concepts because they do talk about the patriarchy quite a bit. And that brings up the issue of to what extent you can draw a direct line at all between ancient Egypt and now, and to what extent the concept of a patriarchy, if that indeed exists, runs our lives, runs society. Now, it's certainly fashionable, and people do talk about the patriarchy as if it exists, but in ancient Egypt, you essentially had a society that was extremely overwhelmed with religion and superstition and essentially risk aversion. So fear of different natural events, weather being one of them. That meant that they were extremely religious in their outlook, and they invoked the gods to help them on their way throughout life, and then even more importantly, throughout death as well. So yes, certainly men occupied the majority of positions external to the house in ancient Egypt, the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. But the reality is that doesn't make a patriarchy. In their case, the ancient Egyptians, it makes for a very significantly overwhelmed society by religion, superstition, fear, and risk aversion, and quite understandably so. Ancient Egypt was not alone in being an ancient society that was overwhelmed by those negative forces. And the question then becomes, well, to what extent do we have a patriarchy in the modern world? And the reality is that we, like the Egyptians, live in a world where society has been generated by the fears and concerns of men and women, by the aggregate judgments, if you like, of male and female humans. I mean, that's what drives our society. Whilst many external positions still are held by men, external to the home, that is, so not inside the home, but outside the home, in broader society, you might say, the public domain, you might say, the reality is that what drives us is not patriarchy or masculinity, toxic or otherwise, or certainly the male gaze. What drives us, quite understandably, is risk aversion and fear of things. And Kahneman and Tversky showed this in their work, for which Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. And Richard Thaler has also won the Nobel Prize for showing the reality of risk aversion, loss aversion in behavioral economics and decision-making heuristics. And so, unfortunately, whilst some people wish to invoke the concept of a patriarchy and toxic masculinity and the male gaze, I'm afraid the reality is those things do not exist in the way people insist they do. What actually exists is an aggregate of human decision-making, male and female, that comprises a lot of human biases, a lot of heuristics, a lot of rule of thumb, if you like, effective theories, approximations. Because facts and knowledge is so limited, we have to use rough rules of thumb. Effective theories in physics, for example, general relativity, quantum mechanics. We do not have the ability to run a society based on a very specific system because, A, men and women have the fear-driven decisions being made every day, so it's a consistent thing. And secondly, many countries believe in a rule of law and a variety of other structures. Those are very much recent adaptations from social evolution. We haven't had the rule of law for 10,000 years. While it's fashionable to talk about patriarchy, the reality is that it doesn't exist in the way that most people, especially feminists, talk about it in a negative way. Unfortunately, the problem that we face is much worse in that society is run by the aggregate of human decisions of men and women that are based very much on risk aversion, on fear. Sometimes on risk favorable, sometimes governments are risk favorable, but more often they are highly risk averse, far more often. And that is what drives society. I understand that some feminists wish to talk of a patriarchy and toxic masculinity and the male gaze, and that to some extent makes them feel better. But the reality is it does not exist in the way they insist it does. Whilst there are men who behave badly, as well as women who behave badly, they both show antisocial behavior in their own way. The reality is that antisocial behavior is not what drives society. What drives society is risk aversion. Now, that may be considered a controversial point, but the reality is it is true. And certainly as a historian, it wouldn't benefit me at all in thinking about society as a patriarchy and history as a whole lot of men behaving badly. Rather, it's very clear that history is the aggregate of human decision-making, male and female, and the vast majority of that decision-making is made on a risk-averse basis. There is no other way to look at it. And of course, that's the only way we can deal with the problems that face society, whether it be poverty alleviation, the need to have a fairer economic society. All of that has to be dealt with by concrete measures, which in many ways aren't predicated on one sex being responsible for the good or the bad that society deals with. Anyway, please let me know what you think. Thanks.